I had my near-death experience. At that time, I was a 54-year-old physician. I spent 15 years teaching neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School. Thought I understood something about brain-mind consciousness, but then I had this extraordinary experience. It completely tipped over my understanding and necessitated a much grander view of this universe. Now, I'd grown up in a very scientific family. I was adopted. That's an incredibly important part of my journey. I was put up for adoption by my birth mother, who was unwed, 16 years old when I was 11 days old, but she wouldn't sign the papers to let me go until I was 4 months old. So anyway, I was adopted into a wonderful, loving family. My adoptive father was a globally renowned neurosurgeon, and he had a very strong belief in God. You know, I still have at my bedside his pocket Bible, New Testament, and Psalms that he had with him in the Pacific Theater during the Second World War. He was overseas 2.5 years and came back relatively unscathed, I believe, because of his strong belief in God and power of prayer. Like many of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, I always knew that science is a pathway to truth. And I made the mistake that many people make of thinking that it was Newtonian deterministic science, whereas in fact it's quantum physics that leads us toward truth. And there's some deep mystery in there about the relationship of brain, mind, consciousness, and the nature of reality. At any rate, so 54 years old, my life going pretty kind of predictably, normally. But then I woke up at 4:30 in the morning with horrific back pain, soon realized I had a terrible headache. And then I lapsed into grand mal seizures at home. There's a myth out there perpetrated by an irresponsible writer trying to pretend this was a medically induced coma. It couldn't be further from the truth. And one of the reasons my coma is so important to the scientific community is because it was induced by a severe case of bacterial meningitis that involved all lobes of my brain. That's a perfect model for human death because it destroys the neocortex, the outer surface of the brain. And that's what I was going through. And yet, contrary to materialist expectations, what happens when you take out the neocortex is you have an enhancement of conscious awareness, because that consciousness is not fundamentally formed in the brain anyway. The brain is a filter that allows in a primordial consciousness. So that's what I'm just beginning to discover. Now, an unusual feature of my near-death experience was that I was amnesic. I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life, of humans, this universe, etc. And so it was really an empty slate. And only in the months and years after my coma did I realize why that was so important for me to fully get the reality of the journey. So in this very amnesic state, it all started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, very primitive course, kind of subterranean, unresponsive realm. And it lasted for a long time, but luckily not forever. There came a slowly spinning white light with fine silvery and golden tendrils around it. And that light came towards me packaged with a perfect musical melody. That was very important because by remembering the notes of the melody, I could later conjure up that same light portal to usher me up through these same spiritual pathways again and again. So that first passage up, I went into this brilliant ultra-real gateway valley. This is where the description becomes very difficult to convey with words. This is the region where we would reunite, for example, with souls of departed loved ones, go through life reviews, plan next incarnations. All that kind of thing can happen in this brilliant kind of world of ideals, but for the individual soul that I'm calling the Gateway Valley. And I never had any body awareness during any part of my journey, but I was aware of what was going on around me. And in the initial stages, that was a beautiful meadow down below. I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in vast formations in incredible beauty. And below us, this tremendous forest going off into the distance, sparkling waterfalls into crystal blue pools. And in fact, I remember seeing all these beings dancing in the meadow down below. And there was lots of joy and merriment and festivities. And it was all being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs, perfect angelic beings that were emanating chants, anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness, this incredible awe and majesty. And yet at the same time, a remembering, oh, this is home. It seems very familiar. In fact, I think a lot of the words I used in Proof of Heaven resonated with people and awakened them in them memories of similar journeys. And I think that's one of the reasons why Proof of Heaven hit with such a bang. I mean, it was kind of, the publishing industry had no idea how it had taken off so powerfully and was on the New York Times bestseller list for the better part of 2 years, including 42 weeks at #1 position. I never expected it to hit that quickly, that powerfully. And yet I think it's this resonance and reminding people of what they've been through that helped to fan those flames. At any rate, so in this beautiful Gateway Valley, seeing all these souls between lives, that's what I labeled them in my writings much later. But the interesting thing is I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful young woman beside me on the butterfly wing, and she had sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, high cheekbones, broad smile. She never said a word to me. She never had to. She looked at me with a look of pure love and this telepathic, empathic, emotional, cognitive message congealed in my mind from hers. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You're richly cared for. And I cannot tell you how refreshing and reassuring that was in that moment. Just incredibly kind of relieving that this was all kind of coming together. And I had this tremendous reassurance from this guardian angel that was very refreshing indeed. And so from then, what I remember seeing is all of the kind of four-dimensional space-time, which I could vaguely sense from that spiritual realm, all of that collapsing down. Then all of the spiritual realm, and here it's important to stress that spiritual realm is eternal. It is not trapped in earth time with this apparent movement of time from past to present to future. But we have access to all of it when we're in that spiritual realm. And that's one of the reasons it's so difficult to explain these events, because when you see it all with such clarity, all simultaneously, and it makes so much more sense, it's hard to even bring a lot of that knowledge back to this world. But anyway, that's what I was seeing. That's what I was witnessing, all of that world collapsing down. And in fact, I entered what I call the core. The core was an infinite inky blackness filled to overflowing with that divine love of that co-creator God at the core of all reality. And that's what I was kind of bathing in and witnessing this incredible journey into oneness, because in fact, at the very depths of this core realm, it was just pure unity, oneness, love, bliss. I called it a dazzling darkness. In many ways, it was a resolution of all dualities. You know, we live in a world of masculine, feminine, good, evil, dark, light. And in that core realm, all these dualities are resolved into oneness. And not only that, I recognized in that realm that all of our conscious awareness is ultimately sourced in that God force. I discovered that for me, and it's a principle for all of us. We're never separate from that God force of pure co-creative love, kindness, compassion, and mercy. This is one of the most important lessons to come out of the entire near-death experience community, and certainly one of the reasons I'm doing my part to help spread this word. At any rate, in the core realm, many things revealed over multiple visits, mostly about the unity of consciousness and the fact that the brain is merely a filter that allows dissociation of an eddy current from that God mind, from that primordial mind that we use as our mind. And yet when the brain and body die, it's liberated back into that ocean of oneness. But with a very important caveat, and that is there's a stream of individuality. And this is very important. A lot of the data that I was shown in my journey fully supported the reality of life reviews and of reincarnation. And reincarnation was never anything I'd considered possible before. And yet my NDE showed me very clearly it was an absolute must law of the universe, because our souls could never get that much work done to become one with the divine in one physical incarnation. This is a very important kind of realization, but to me, life reviews and reincarnation are incredibly powerful principles that need to be stressed in trying to explain this thing we call humanity and our kind of human condition. At any rate, I would tumble back down from that core realm back into the earth or my view. And it was by remembering the musical notes of the melody that first appeared to me in that earth or my view that I can conjure up that light portal that would again take me up into that brilliant Gateway Valley with the guardian angel on the butterfly wing, all of that multiple times over. And one of the visions I had at the very end was especially strong about the reincarnation and life review. It's a vision that I call the living tapestry. And that's really because it was a view of all these interwoven threads, and I could see they were the, birth, life, death, life review, reuniting with souls of departed loved ones, planning next incarnations, then diving back in. And I didn't realize how much support there was for reincarnation in the scientific world. 10 miles from where I live is the University of Virginia, where over the last 65 years, they've studied more than 2,500 cases of past life memory claims in children suggestive of reincarnation. And of those claims, 1,700 plus they have solved. That is, they actually found the person who lived before. So reincarnation is scientifically validated beyond any reasonable doubt. Any kind of model of brain and mind must somehow take into account life reviews and near-death experiences, shared death experiences, which are just like near-death, but happen in perfectly healthy people, et cetera. So anyway, back to my story. What in that beautiful living tapestry vision was close to the end of my journey. Every time I entered the Corps, I was told, you're not here to stay, you'll be going back, but we'll teach you many things. And this, after multiple passages, this is what happened. I could no longer conjure up the light portal through remembering the musical notes of the melody. And to say I was sad at that point would be an understatement, but I knew I could trust I would be taken care of. I'd been promised that every time by that beautiful guardian angel, and certainly by reassurance from the God force deep in the core of pure, binding, unconditional love. And so now I find myself barred from ascent into those higher spiritual levels, but then I witness that there are thousands of beings who are off around me, many with heads bowed, some holding candles, and they were leading me back to this world. And the last thing I saw in my journey was 6 faces that would bubble up out of the muck. They'd say a few words and then disappear. I still couldn't understand the words because of my amnesia, but I can remember those faces as vividly today as if the whole thing happened yesterday morning. And they were faces of people physically present in the ICU room the last 24 to 48 hours of coma. And there was one exception to that, a woman who had been a friend of mine all the way back to 1972. A woman named Susan Renches, who was a friend also of my former spouses, who I was married to at the time of my coma. And they knew that Susan had written a book, Third Eye Open, about her experience channeling to people in coma and channeling to very ill people to try and heal them. And they called her up and had her channel to me on the 4th and 5th nights of my coma. And I remember her as vividly as anyone else being there. So it's no surprise to me. In that realm, there's no limit of time or space. And so when they said, well, that was Susan, but she was never within 120 miles of your hospital room, I said, well, of course, that makes perfect sense. But it was the last face of the 6 that really got my attention. It was a 10-year-old boy, and I didn't recognize him at the time. But the whole week, they told Bond, my youngest son, 10 years old, that I was extremely ill, but hadn't told him the worst. And the worst came out that Sunday morning, day 7 of coma, when the doctors held a family conference saying I gone from 10% chance of survival early in the week down to 2% chance of survival here on day 7, Sunday. And they recommended just stopping the antibiotics, taking me off the ventilator, and just letting me go. And that's when I started coming back to this world. But that's when Bond came running down the hallway and pulled open my eyelids, one eye looking over there, another eye looking that way, neither pupil working. Anybody in medicine knows that's a horrible picture. And Bond was pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay, as if somehow that would make it so. And that's what basically demanded me to come back to this world. I had thought with my amnesia through this vast experience, it could continue, it can cease, doesn't matter. But now all of a sudden, my amnesia, the shield of it had been broken. And I realized there was another soul out there who needed me dearly. And he was pleading with me. And so I had to come back. And that's basically what led me back to this world. Now, I was soon fighting the ventilator. They pulled out the breathing tube. I said, thank you. But my amnesia was still very powerful. I didn't even recognize initially my mother, my sisters, my sons at the bedside. But those memories came back very quickly, as did memories of language, et cetera. And I still had a 36-hour kind of ICU psychosis nightmare to go through after they extubated me. But in that psychosis, I knew that what I was witnessing was a delusion. I knew it wasn't real. Very different from what I experienced deep in the spiritual journey when my brain was very deactivated. And that has all been confirmed by a medical case report published in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases in September 2018. Case report written by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery. And in that case report, they make it very clear to anybody who's medically trained that that brain was in no shape to have any kind of dream or hallucination, much less this profound, ultra-real spiritual experience that I did have. And not only that, the peer review editors challenged the authors, how do you explain this unprecedented recovery? And they said it's because he had a near-death experience. They knew of similar cases of miraculous healing in the setting of a near-death experience, and said that is the reason he could recover like this. And that was a good enough explanation for the scientific peer review editor, so they published it. And I've spent the last 18 years since all these events happened working with other scientists around the world, working with thousands of other experiencers, near-death, after-death communications, shared death, all these various manifestations of this extraordinary consciousness beyond the brain. Our books, including the last one, Living in a Mindful Universe, go into great detail about how science and spirituality are coming together over all of this. There's a revolution brewing, but most of the world doesn't know that yet. The scientific world is well aware of it, those who study consciousness. And this revolution is not going to ever turn around and go backwards into the bleak and paltry fiction of materialism, because all the evidence leads the other way, towards primacy of consciousness, the binding force of love, the healing power of concepts of oneness and connection. So that's basically my near-death experience and how it's led me into kind of a whole new understanding of the nature of reality, and work with other scientists to modify our scientific worldviews to fully allow for this rich spiritual nature of the universe. But luckily, my older son, Eben IV, who was majoring in college in neuroscience in college at the time, he came home 2 days after I got out of the hospital, day before Thanksgiving 2008. And he told me, write everything down before you read anybody else's near-death experience. Best advice I've ever gotten. He knew from studying neuroscience that every time you revisit a memory, you can change it or alter it. And therefore, I had to get the story right from the get-go and record my memories as accurately as possible, but without the influence of anybody else's near-death experience. But I've learned a tremendous amount about them since that time, as you can imagine. My memories were coming back. It was too real to be real. And yet, you know, as I was studying all this, kind of revisiting in my mind what I'd been through, it didn't make any sense, because I was reviewing my medical records, my CT and MRI scans, my neurologic exams, and they were of a brain that was far too dead to be doing anything. So where did that experience come from? And it came at a time when my brain was demonstrably most damaged and offline, deep in the middle of the coma. So those demanded some kind of explanation. And I was back and forth over exactly how far I had to go in which direction for that explanation. But it was really when I got that picture in the mail 4 months after my coma. That's how the book Proof of Heaven comes to an end, is with that very specific event. And that was the oh my God moment of it. The reason it seemed way too real to be real was because it really happened. It didn't happen in the material realm, but it absolutely happened in a realm more real than this one. And that's what was kind of shocked me into, oh my gosh, now I really have to come to an understanding of it. And the very fact that those peer review editors also agreed, you know, there's no explanation for this case other than the fact he had a near-death experience, a very powerful spiritual experience with a connection with God that led to tremendous healing. I mean, what more do you want? And that's what we see in a lot of near-death experience cases. The reason they said that was because they knew of other cases like Anita Morjani, who basically got rid of her stage 4 advanced lymphoma after a near-death experience, or Dr. Mary C. Neal, orthopedic surgeon who had a over 30-minute warm water drowning while kayaking in Chile in the late 1990s, brought to the surface dead. Well, they resuscitated her. She made a full recovery. And so Anita and Mary Neal and myself, near-death experiencers who had miraculous healings, we go around and we share these stories. And the more I think we can do medical case reports on these kinds of cases, the better we'll come to an understanding of how these miraculous healings can become fairly standard in a more spiritually awakened world. By far, the most memorable thing is the swimming in this ocean of complete and absolute unconditional love, and that was enough to awaken that same memory in many other people who had it deep in their soul journey. They knew what I was talking about. That ocean of love is kind of indescribable. That's why near-death experiencers come back to this world and they no longer fear death. They realize it's not an extinction of conscious awareness, but actually an expansion. But this is where I need to make it very, very clear to people that reincarnation is a big part of the package, because some people misinterpret. They take, for example, a conventional Christian interpretation where you have a life and then eternal heaven or hell afterwards. And that really doesn't make any sense. This is where we actually get the soul work done. And it's very important to understand this concept of reincarnation. Is our goal is to become closer and closer to that kind of God mind in our knowledge and understanding of self and reason for the universe. And that is not something we can do very well from an ego position. So it takes this kind of expansion and cultivating a relationship with higher soul and with that primordial mind. And that's where I think meditation, centering prayer are so important. This is where I often recommend what my practice is. The last 13 years, for an hour or two every day, I've been using sacredacoustics.com binaural beat brainwave entrainment to get into very deep transcendental states of conscious awareness. There's a beautiful pilot study from Dr. Anna Yusum investigating sacred acoustics tones for anxiety. That pilot study appeared in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases in February of 2020 and made it clear that in a 2 weeks of listening gave a 26% reduction in anxiety versus only a 7% reduction in the control group that got standard talk psychotherapy during those 2 weeks. So that's a very powerful, almost fourfold improvement in relief of anxiety just by listening to sacred acoustics tones. And I promise you, there's a lot more going on there than just ease of anxiety. So meditation, centering prayer, going within, these are powerful ways that each and every one of us can connect with that same powerful force of love, healing, and wholeness and come into healing in our own lives. It's important to point out that the proof of my reality for me of this journey was the identity of that beautiful guardian angel. That's the thing that really shocked me into, oh my God, it really happened. This came, after weeks of writing everything I could about my experience. That was 20,000 words over about 6 weeks. Then I dove deep into the near-death experience literature. And I was more and more mystified by it, because if I had scripted this whole thing, my adoptive father would have been there. He had passed over 4 years before my coma, and yet he was nowhere to be found. And he finally did show up in a deep meditation using sacred acoustics style binaural beat brainwave entrainment about 2.5 years after my coma. And in that appearance, he made it clear to me why he couldn't be apparent to me during the coma. And the explanation from him at that time was, in spite of a 1 in 10 million diagnosis of E. coli meningitis in an adult, in spite of a 1 in a billion recovery, if I had seen my adoptive father there, I might have been a little more tempted to default to my prior conventional materialist view and think, oh, you just see who you want to see on the way out. And in some ways, kind of the universe and that God force knew I had to go a level deeper. And that's why I had the amnesia. And that's why my adoptive father was not present to me in the NDE. And that's why, in fact, the guardian angel was a beautiful woman, very important to me in my life, but I'd never known her because she was a birth sister from my birth family. And she had passed over in 1998, 2 years before I even found out about her existence. And once I saw her, it's almost like she's looking at me in the picture as if to say, do you finally get it? And yes, Betsy, I finally get it. I finally understood the deep message of the reality of this journey. And in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, I tell that full story about reuniting with my father's soul and many other things that bring all this so that the science and spirituality combine and strengthen each other. Well, it was very strange in that there was never any point during my NDE that I thought that I may be, quote, dying or separate from my body. I never had any body awareness during the NDE. But then all of a sudden, I'm kind of back in it, fighting this ventilator and kind of feeling a lot of the physical pain and discomfort of recovering from my meningitis. So it was very kind of confusing, would be a great word for it. And as I said, I went in and out of a paranoid delusional ICU psychosis, a psychotic nightmare, for 36 hours after awakening. And yet I knew in the midst of that crazy nightmare that it was delusions, that none of that was real. And that was very different from what I'd experienced deep in coma. And so during the few weeks of recovering there, I needed physical therapy. I had some trouble with balance, other things, but all of that recovered very quickly. And in fact, all my memories were back within about 2 months. And an astonishing thing about the memories was that I soon recognized, based on very deep conversations with family and friends, that some of the early childhood memories were more complete after the coma than they had been before the coma. And that's a very important thing, that memories are not even stored in the brain. It's a fact that we discuss in our book, Living in a Biological Universe, because neurosurgeons have been faced with that reality for the better part of a century and a half of doing brain operations. We've never had a case where any brain resection resulted in a loss of long-term memories. It just never happens. And that includes some cases, for example, with severe epileptic seizures in early childhood. Sometimes you take out half the brain, a hemispherectomy. And yet you do not lose any long-term memories with those kinds of operations. So just an incredible experience coming back into the body, of getting to full healing, which none of my doctors ever thought was remotely possible. And yet that's what happened within about 2 months of my waking up from coma. And I've continued to enjoy beautiful health in the 18 years since all that happened. Well, all I remembered when I woke up from coma was where I'd just been on that beautiful spiritual journey. I initially had none of my early life memories of Eben Alexander's life, but that all came back fairly quickly. And I just wanted to emphasize, I didn't have an Eben Alexander life review, but I saw life reviews and reincarnation in very powerful form. I already discussed that a little while ago about the visions in the core realm, especially that living tapestry that very clearly showed the eternity of souls, and that we're always have the capacity to interact and connect with each other, with loved ones. The relationships are the most important part of our existence, and that's why they feature so prominently in those life reviews. Well, initially, I tried to share it with my doctors, and I would try to share it with my family. My family was very open to allowing me to talk about it. Doctors were a little quicker to kind of shut me down, pat me on the back, and say, well, your brain was soaking in pus. We have no idea how you're even coming back to us now. But you can forget about it, because a dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. So I took my doctor's word for it. Okay, it seemed way too real to be real, because it was some vast hallucination. That's what the doctors were trying to tell me. But truth of the matter is, they knew something big had happened. And these stories are told in the 10th anniversary edition of the book, Proof of Heaven. But basically, I was invited to my own morbidity mortality conference. Those are the conferences about the sickest patients, and many of whom went on to die. And it's very rare for such a patient to be able to go enjoy contributing to their own morbidity mortality conference. But not only that, the county medical society, doctors in my hospital were so fascinated by my recovery that they ended up hosting a big dinner at a local country club, where I gave a talk to 120 fellow physicians and their families about my experience. They all wanted to know, how do you explain this? This was a big miracle. It wasn't just my interpretation of a miraculous healing. This is the whole hospital professional staff revealing, my gosh, something very amazing happened in this case. Let's try and understand it better. And the scientific side has been my biggest supporters really through this whole thing. People often think this is about spirituality versus science, or religion versus science. And ultimately, it's about a unification of science and spirituality, and a unification of religions to realize they've all been talking about the same thing all along. There's no reason to move away from the deep message of the prophets of love, compassion, kindness, mercy, acceptance, forgiveness. These are the principles we need to live by. And these are the principles taught most powerfully from the experiences of those who have been near death and come back to tell the tale. Well, I think what it changed in me was a much bigger focus on souls and soul groups and what souls are doing here. Just like most NDEers, I came back much less materialistic, more focused on the higher good and on helping people. And that's exactly what I started to see. And it was a complete flip when you realize that our consciousness connects us all, and not just human beings, but connected with all sentient life throughout the cosmos. Then you start to realize there's something much bigger going on with these stories, and an understanding of our kind of role in the universe and how we interact with each other and with that God force of co-creativity at the core of all creation. So it really kind of completely shifts things. You get away from egocentric and narcissistic focus. Those are signs of a very immature, very childish early soul, but start cultivating a relationship with our higher soul, which is much more focused on the higher good and on world peace and on unification of humanity, on improvement of situation for all of our animal and plant friends, making this planet a better place overall. That's the big focus that comes in after near-death experiences and learning about them. So It's really about making the world a far better place and moving us away from that bleak and paltry fiction of materialism that pretends that we're just meat robots, that we're birth to death, nothing more, that there's nothing to the story as a soul, whereas the soul is everything that is going on in our lives. Well, my adoptive father, as I said earlier, was had a strong belief in God and power of prayer. He used it in his work as a neurosurgeon, as a healer. And to me, I wanted to believe a lot of that, but the longer I was in neurosurgery, kind of going through my daily work of working with the brain, with people with damaged brains and trying to fix all that, the more I realized I really didn't have an understanding of how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. And I guess that's why I needed my own very, very deep dive into that territory to understand how that can be the way the world works, but it is. And this is why it's so important to share all this. I think for anyone in your audience who doubts that there is already, beyond a reasonable doubt, scientific proof for the afterlife, I would steer them to bigelowinstitute.org. That website has 29 essays, all written by scientists with at least 5 years experience investigating the afterlife question. And when you start reading those bigelowinstitute.org essays, you'll quickly realize the afterlife is absolutely real. Any scientist who denies it is simply admitting to willful ignorance of the data. But the data is there and fully supports the reality, not just of the afterlife, but of reincarnation. Well, I'm much more optimistic. I see life as very positive. Now, I'm not ignoring all the negative headlines and the polarization and the warfare and the violence going on in our world. But what I recognize is we have an antidote for all that. And that antidote is in this form of the scientific revolution brewing around the nature of consciousness and how we're really sharing that one mind, and that binding force of love is so critical. So in other words, what I'm seeing is the revolution that is coming in the next 5 to 10 years, this incredible kind of shift of thinking of humanity away from that fiction of materialism that's so bleak, all towards a far more positive, transformational, kind of evolutionarily exciting vision of consciousness and the role of human beings in moving us to the next level. Basically taking 5 to 10,000 years of human thought and shifting and understanding and taking it to a whole new level of understanding. That's where we're headed with this scientific revolution. And that's why I'm so optimistic. But it also involves that the old ways, the narcissistic, authoritarian, warmongering, people holding nuclear arms over other people's heads, those people will go into distant past memory, because the world of the future doesn't have room for such egotistical, narcissistic damage and dysfunction as we're seeing in our modern world. So it's time for the world to grow up and mature into a far more powerful and capable humanity. I certainly have made a lot of tremendous new friends, and a lot of my old friendships have been greatly strengthened. Certainly a lot of the professional ties, people reaching out to me, in the neurosurgical, neuroscience communities. Very grateful that I, went public with my story to help wake this world up to a much deeper, richer, more powerful, and empowering truth about who we are and what our purpose for existence is. So to me, there's great cause for optimism, but it's also a reason why I do hundreds of podcasts and try and get this out there in every way I can, because this world is in some danger right now. Our addiction to fossil fuels is absolutely destroying this world for thousands of species. It is time to move away from that addiction, get onto sustainable fuels, and move away from the warmongering autocratic leaders who are so out of touch with the modern world and where this world can actually head. That's very promising for prosperity and for well-being for all. The more we can help others, bring love and healing and kindness into this world, the better a world will be for us and for each other and for humanity at large. So this oneness is not saying it's going to disappear. We all discover this when we die and leave this world. But that's why near-death experiences are so important, because they teach you this very important lesson about oneness, love, kindness, compassion, mercy, and helping each other long before we leave the physical world. And that's why it's so important to get this message now and start living, so that by the end of your life, you're not that extremely disappointed materialist who realizes they were wrong all that time, when they start seeing loved ones appear to them as they're preparing to transition from their living body, they realize that this is real. It's not imaginary. It's not wishful thinking, but our souls are eternal and their relationships are never ending. About 2 years post-coma, I started meditating every day, an hour or two a day, and that has been a tremendous benefit. I've used it to cultivate and nurture my relationships with the various guides and wisdom and that God force, at the primordial mind across the veil. And I've used it for kind of higher soul to higher soul communications. If I'm having any kind of challenge or difficulty with another human being, I basically go in meditation and higher soul to higher soul communications, which is always about getting the highest and best good for all involved. And things seem to work out. I think the main message is, enjoy life, love one another, discover more of who you are, but who you are is basically sharing the mind of the universe. So who you are is getting right in there with that co-creative God force at the source of all emergent reality. So this is a beautiful journey of discovery. And once you've discovered that your mind is not something, created in a 3.5-pound gelatinous mass floating in a warm, dark bath between my ears, but is the mind of the universe, then it becomes far more interesting and powerful to see what we can do by exploring that conscious awareness. Well, there's nothing to fear about death. It's a liberation back into the kind of freedom of the much bigger world. As I said, that all the scientific literature on reincarnation is very powerful. The University of Virginia group having found over 1,700 cases that they solved. The important message about the reincarnation is it shows us that there's a soul line that goes from lifetime to lifetime that preserves our actions and thoughts. And that's the important thing to pay attention to. And that's why I keep stressing this importance of the soul relationships, soul groups, the interactions of souls. That's what our whole existence is really all about. And the more we can kind of honor that and nurture it and grow it and take advantage of it in terms of discovering our true purpose for being and how we can make this universe a better place. All of that is a tremendous gift once we start discovering that there's a world far beyond our little ego voice. I love how Michael Singer in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that voice in your head your annoying roommate. Don't believe for 1 second that the voice in your head is your soul or your consciousness. It is not. It's merely a parlor trick. There's a much deeper aspect of you, your higher soul, that connects to that. And that's what can be developed and cultivated through meditation and centering prayer. So this is where we start this process of discovery of just how grand our mind can actually be.